degrading confession of feminine weakness. She imagines the terrible rejoicings of certain girlfriends, of certain grosser cousins from whom her growing refinement had long since estranged her. How they would make it sprawl across the envelope that would bring their sarcastic congratulations. Would even his pleasant company compensate her for that?
It is impossible. Impossible! Snooks.
She was sorry for him, but not so sorry as she was for herself. For him, she had a touch of indignation. To be so nice, so refined, while all the time he was Snooks. To hide under a pretentious gentility of demeanour the badge sinister of his surname seemed a sort of treachery. To put it in the language of sentimental science, she felt he had led her on. There were, of course, moments of terrible vacillation, a period when even something almost like passion bid her throw a refinement to the winds. And there was something in her, an unexpurgated vestige of vulgarity, that made a strenuous attempt at proving that Snooks was not so very bad a name after all. Any hovering hesitation flew before Fanny's manner, when Fanny came in with an air of catastrophe to tell her that she also knew the horror. Fanny's voice fell to a whisper when she said, "Snooks." Miss Winchelsea would not give him any answer when at last, in the Borgies, she could have a minute with him, but she promised him a note. She handed him that note in the little book of poetry he had lent her, the little book that had first drawn them together. Her refusal was ambiguous, elusive. She could no more tell him why she rejected him than she could have told a cripple of his hump. He too must feel something of the unspeakable quality of his name. Indeed, he had avoided a dozen chances of telling it, she now perceived. So she spoke of obstacles she could not reveal, reasons why the thing he spoke of was impossible. She addressed the note with a shiver. E.K. Snooks. Things were worse than she had dreaded. He asked her to explain. How could she explain? Those last 2 days in Rome were dreadful. She was haunted by his air of astonished perplexity. She knew she had given him intimate hopes. She had not the courage to examine her mind thoroughly for the extent of her encouragement. She knew he must think her the most changeable of beings. Now that she was in full retreat, she would not even perceive hints of a possible correspondence. But in that matter, he did a thing that seemed to her at once delicate and romantic. He made a go-between of Fanny. Fanny could not keep the secret, and came and told her that night under a transparent pretext of needed advice.
Mr. Snooks wants to write to me. Fancy. I had no idea. But should I let him?
They talked it over long and earnestly, and Miss Winchelsea was careful to keep the veil over her heart. She was already repenting his disregarded hints. Why should she not hear of him sometimes, painful though his name must be to her? Miss Winchelsea decided it might be permitted, and Fanny kissed her goodnight with unusual emotion. After she had gone, Miss Winchelsea sat down for a long time at the window of her little room. It was moonlight, and down the street a man sang Santa Lucia, with almost heart-dissolving tenderness. She sat very still. She breathed a word very softly to herself. The word was Snooks. Then she got up with a profound sigh and went to bed. Mr. Snooks saw them off from Rome with that pathetic, interrogative perplexity still on his face, and if it had not been for Helen, he would have retained Miss Winchelsea's hold-all in his hand as a sort of encyclopedic keepsake. On the way back to England, Miss Winchelsea on 6 separate occasions made Fanny promise to write to her the longest of long letters. Fanny, it seemed, would be quite near Mr. Snooks. Her new school, as she was always going to new schools, would be only 5 miles from Steely Bank. It was in the Steely Bank Polytechnic, and 1 or 2 first-class schools, that Mr. Snooks did his teaching. Might even see her at times. They could not talk much of him, and she and Fanny always spoke of him, never of Mr. Snooks, because Helen was apt to say unsympathetic things about him. Her nature had coarsened very much, Miss Winchelsea perceived, since the old training college days. She had become hard and cynical. She thought he had a weak face, mistaking refinement for weakness as people of her stamp are apt to do, and when she heard his name as Snooks, she said she had expected something of the sort. Miss Winchelsea was careful to spare her own feelings after that, but Fanny was less circumspect. The girls parted in London, and Miss Winchelsea returned with a new interest in life to the girls' high school in which she had been an increasingly valuable assistant for the last 3 years. Her new interest in life was Fanny as a correspondent, and to give her a lead, she wrote her a lengthy descriptive letter within a fortnight of her return. Fanny answered, varying disappointingly. Fanny indeed had no literary gift, but it was new to Miss Winchelsea to find herself deploring the want of gifts in a friend. That letter was even criticised aloud in the safe solitude of Miss Winchelsea's study, and her criticism, spoken with great bitterness, was twaddle. It was full of just the things Miss Winchelsea's letter had been full of, particulars of the school, and of Mr. Snooks, only this much.
I have had a letter from Mr. Snooks, and he has been over to see me on 2 Saturday afternoons running. We talked about Rome, and you. We both talked about you. Your ears must have been burnt, my dear.
Miss Winchelsea repressed a desire to demand more explicit information, and wrote the sweetest long letter again.
Tell me all about yourself, dear. That journey has quite refreshed our ancient friendship, and I do so want to keep in touch with you.
About Mr. Snooks, she simply wrote on the 5th page that she was glad Fanny had seen him, and that if he should ask for her, she was to be remembered of him very kindly, underlined. And Fanny replied most obtusely in the key of that ancient friendship, reminding Miss Winchelsea of a dozen foolish things of those old schoolgirl days at the training college, and saying not a word about Mr. Snooks. For nearly a week, Miss Winchelsea was so angry at the failure of Fanny as a go-between that she could not write to her. And then she wrote less effusively, and in her letter she asked point blank.
Have you seen Mr. Snooks?
Fanny's letter was unexpectedly satisfactory,
I have seen Mr. Snooks.
and having once named him, she kept on about him. It was all Snooks. Snooks this and Snooks that. He was to give a public lecture, said Fanny, among other things. Yet Miss Winchelsea, after the first glow of gratification, still found this letter a little unsatisfactory. Fanny did not report Mr. Snooks as saying anything about Miss Winchelsea, nor as looking a little white and worn, as he ought to have been doing. And behold, before she had replied, came a second letter from Fanny on the same theme, quite a gushing letter and covering 6 sheets with her loose feminine hand. And about this second letter was a rather odd little thing that Miss Winchelsea only noticed as she reread it the 3rd time. Fanny's natural femininity had prevailed even against the round and clear traditions of the training college. She was one of those she-creatures born to make all her M's and N's and U's and R's and E's alike, and to leave her O's and A's open and her I's undotted. So that was only after an elaborate comparison of word with word that Miss Winchelsea felt assured that Mr. Snooks was not really Mr. Snooks at all. In Fanny's first letter of gush, he was Mr. Snooks. In her second, the spelling was changed to Mr. Sennooks. Miss Winchelsea's hand positively trembled as she turned the sheet over. It meant so much to her, for it had already begun to seem to her that even the name of Mrs. Snooks might be avoided at too great a price.